What did my son do when my husband lost his temper at a referee and my son was on the field watching? Saturday morning soccer game. My husband Gary is on the sideline. He has been managing to stay calm for most of the season. Today, minute 31, the referee makes a call Gary doesn't agree with. Gary yells. He yells loud. He yells, "Are you serious right now?" He yells other things. The referee looks at him. Parents around him shift. My 11-year-old son, Finn, is on the field. He hears this. He is 11. He knows his father's voice. He finishes the half. He comes off the field. He gets his water bottle. He drinks. He looks at Gary. He says nothing. He goes back for the second half. He plays the second half. His team wins. He comes off the field after. He walks to Gary. Gary is happy now. He says, "Great game, bud." Finn says, "Thanks." He drinks water. He says, "Dad." Gary says, "Yeah." Finn opens his bag. He takes out his notebook. He says, "I heard you in the first half." Gary shifts. He says, "The call was wrong." Finn says, "Possibly." He opens the notebook. He says, "I have a question." Gary says, "Yeah." Finn says, "When I make a mistake during a game, what do you tell me to do?" Gary thinks. He says, "Keep playing." Finn nods. He writes it down. He shows Gary. He says, "Keep playing." Gary reads it. Finn says, "And when a coach makes a decision you don't agree with, what do you tell me to do?" Gary thinks again. He says, "Respect the process." Finn writes it. He shows Gary. "Respect the process." He looks at him. He says, "The referee made a call." Gary says, "It was the wrong call." Finn says, "Possibly." He says, "But what did you tell me?" He shows him both lines. "Keep playing. Respect the process." He looks at Gary. He says, "You were louder than the play." Gary goes quiet. Finn drinks more water. He says, "Dad." Gary says, "Yeah." Finn says, "When you yell at the referee, the other kids on the field hear it." He looks at Gary. He says, "Not just me." He says, "All of them." He says, "They're listening to what parents do." He says, "It tells them what's okay." Gary looks at the field. He looks at the other kids packing up. He looks at Finn. He says, "I didn't think about that." Finn says, "I know." He closes the notebook. He puts it in his bag. He says, "You always tell me how I act on the field matters." He looks at Gary. He says, "Same for the sideline." He zips his bag. He stands. He says, "I want tacos." Gary stands. He says, "Yeah, let's go." They walk. Gary puts his hand on Finn's shoulder. Finn lets him. They walk to the car. I follow. At the tacos place, Gary orders. He pays. He brings everything to the table. He sits. He says, "Finn?" Finn says, "Yeah." He says, "You were right." Finn unwraps his taco. He says, "I know." He eats. He says, "Also the call was probably wrong." Gary almost laughs. He says, "It was definitely wrong." Finn says, "Possibly wrong." He eats. He says, "We don't know for sure." Gary looks at him. He says, "Where do you get that?" Finn says, "Coach Rivera says, possibly whenever he's not certain." He says, "I'm trying it out." Gary nods. He eats his taco. He says, "It's a good word." Finn says, "It leaves room." He eats. He says, "For being wrong without being committed to being wrong." Gary is quiet for a moment. He says, "That's a good distinction." Finn says, "Coach Rivera's smart." He finishes his taco. He opens his notebook. He writes something. He shows Gary. He's written, "Sideline conduct conversation, productive." Gary reads it. He reads it twice. He says, "Productive." Finn nods. He says, "You heard me." He says, "And you didn't get defensive." He says, "That's productive." He closes the notebook. He gets a second taco. He says, "Next game, I want you to try one, possibly." Gary says, "At the referee?" Finn says, "Instead of 'Are you serious right now?'" He looks at him. He says, "Possibly, ref." He says, "Say that instead." Gary stares at him. He says, "Possibly, ref." Finn nods. He eats his taco. He says, "It's harder to yell." Gary picks up his own taco. He says, "Yeah." He says, "Possibly." Why? He tries it at a low volume. Finn nods. He says, "Now you've practiced." He opens his notebook. He writes, "Pre-game sideline prep complete. All hail Finn, age 11, possibly pioneer. Sideline conduct coach." He gave Gary one word and told him to practice it at the taco place.